Hello, and welcome to the first installment of a group of readings from the commentary on the book of Jeremiah written by Stanley Romaine Hopper, included in the Interpreter's Bible, Volume 5. I'll be taking Hopper's commentary about a chapter at a pop, and he takes a handful of verses at a time and does a little exposition on that. But they can get quite lengthy, so I'll only be doing a chapter at a time. Without further ado, we begin with chapter 1, verses 1 through 5. Jeremiah. Yahweh hurls. Jeremiah belongs with that class of men described by Unamuno as men of flesh and bone. He was, like these, an agnostic soul, one whose burden is wisdom rather than knowledge, and who through compassion, suffering, and love moves unflinchingly into the deepest defiles of his time's predicament. He looked into his time's abyss, and though there were moments when he recoiled from its terrors, he returned again and again to gaze more deeply until beyond and beneath every anguish of his age, he discovered a new transcendent ground of hope. The three introductory verses, flat and unimaginative as they seem, are singularly appropriate, as though the editors of Jeremiah's book had sensed how utterly impossible it would be to introduce either the prophet or his book. Overtures to his greatness, while paying him conventional praise, would fail to adduce him. The man Jeremiah, the man of flesh and bone, the man who was rejected by his family and local community, the man who was obliged to oppose priests, kings, prophets, and people, the man who stood at the last altogether alone, a coerced exile with the poor remnant of his people in Egypt, the man whose entire life was prolonged martyrdom to the integrity of his faith, the man whom Yahweh hurled into the most crucial and most tragic period in the entire history of Israel. This is the man who is too easily lost behind the protective barriers of the scholar's praise, or behind our unconscious resistance, though epochs removed, to the uncomfortably true. Into what kind of situation was Jeremiah hurled? He was hurled into the time of Judah's last catastrophe. This was the period of the decline and fall of the little kingdom. He was hurled into the time of great contention between competing world powers, and, with his people, stood in the midst of their vast collisions. Not only was Judah a political bauble in the contending play of the great states, but she was, as Toynbee says, pounded on their native threshing floor by an Assyrian flail. It is perhaps even more important to see beyond and behind and underneath this great agitation of the time that Jeremiah was also hurled into what Karl Jaspers has called a great axial age of world history. Quote, "The spiritual process which took place between 800 and 200 BC seems to constitute an axis. It was then that the man with whom we live today came into being," unquote. This was the age of Confucius and Lao Tse, of Mo Tse, Chuang-Tzu, Lao Tse, and others in China, of the Upanishads and of Buddha in India, of Zoroaster in Persia, of Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, the prophet of the exile in Palestine, of Homer, Parmenides, Heraclitus, Plato, the great tragedians, Thucydides, and Archimedes in Greece. Man everywhere became aware of being as a whole, of himself and his limits. He experienced the horror of the world and his own helplessness. He raised radical questions, approached the abyss in his drive for liberation and redemption, and in unconsciously apprehending his limits, he set himself the highest aims. He experienced the absolute in the depth of selfhood and in the clarity of transcendence. We note here simply that the Hebrew prophets of this age, and Jeremiah particularly, are hurled into the tensions of extreme political clash, that in their highest moments of insight they see through these tensions, recognizing them as fortuitous results of deeper causes, symptoms of an underlying shift in the racial consciousness. They see through the surface tensions to the real limits and polarities of the human situation, where the consciousness of God as the real being takes hold. Their message will break through the structures by which the truth has heretofore been channeled, and which have now become oppressive. It will be resisted by the people and all the vested interests by, quote, who fear the blessing of God, the loneliness of the night of God, the surrender required, the deprivation inflicted, who fear the injustice of men less than the justice of God. End quote. Footnote. T.S. Eliot, Murder in the Cathedral. Into this loneliness of the night of God, Jeremiah was also hurled. He could hardly have sustained such pressures as these had his sense of call been less profound. This we shall discover in the following pages. In the interpretations here set forth, the reader will note certain discrepancies between points of view expressed by the exegete and the expositor. Since they are not mainly of a technical kind, the majority, more likely than not, will be noticed. On the critical side, the chief difference is that the expositor does not conform to the exegete's thesis of the later date for Jeremiah's birth. The evidence of this does not appear conclusive. It seems to create, from the standpoint of exposition, as many problems as it solves. This difference will affect certain local perspectives on the oracles and other matters under consideration, such as the placing and the date of the so-called Scythian poems. Also, some recognition of the principle of growth and development in prophetic consciousness of Jeremiah seems, on literary grounds, to be essential to an understanding of the deeper implications of the book. The expositor has attempted to supplement the literary critical approach by many of the disclosures of the historical traditional school. The latter view releases us at many points from the limitations of a one-way theory of time, that is, from the view that all that is quote-unquote late, the Deuteronomist editing, must on that account be quote-unquote secondary and foreign to Jeremiah's aims. Secondly, it releases us into a recognition of the larger aesthetic unities, forms, and strategies which the literary critical approach seems to overlook. The poetic strategies of the biblical poets and their aesthetic forms are much more nearly akin to the strategies of contemporary poetry than to any other literature. Affinities may be found with the strategies of the metaphysical poets, Elizabethan drama, or in such double-pointed symbolizations as appear in the second part of Goethe's Faust. There would also be some points of contact with the Greek tragedies, particularly those of Aeschylus. The remaining difference ties in with this. It has to do with the logic and the theologic with which we try to classify and appraise the book's content. The Hebrew mind is not the Western mind. Its quote-unquote thought does not assimilate to our Western hierarchical forms. It is what we should today call quote-unquote existential. Its concern is not for accuracy of place or date, but for the large symbolic use of these as evocative of decision and response. Theologically, the exegeter and the expositor are not formally in disagreement, but again, the dynamic elements in Jeremiah's context of the covenant relation are not adduced in the formal summation of his ideas about God, sin, eschatology, and the like. The expositor attempts, therefore, to supplement these necessary formal statements by setting them within the vital context of Jeremiah's passion, which everywhere impinges upon the universal human need. Side note, the expositor is Hopper. This identification in our time is fairly easy to arrive at. Stephen Zweig tells how, when he was caught up in the frenzy of World War I, he, quote, sought for a symbol to express these problems of solitude in the midst of hypnotized masses, of tragic forebodings and painful presentiments. My first sketches were meant for a Cassandra, but soon it was the character of Jeremiah that forced itself upon me, for, being biblical, it was closer to me and closer also for being bound up with the people. End quote. Quote, but soon it was the character of Jeremiah that forced itself upon me, end quote. This is the experience of every careful reader, every careful student of the book of Jeremiah. The effect of this on Zweig evoked with vividness the situation into which Jeremiah was hurled. In his drama, Zweig shows the hosts of Nebuchadnezzar encamped around Jerusalem, and two lone sentries standing in white moonlight keeping watch upon the ramparts of the city, conversing. Quote, 2nd century, do you hear? 1st century, what? 2nd century, the sound is very faint, but the breeze bears it to us. When I was in Joppa, for the first time I heard in the night the distant murmur of the waves. Such a sound rises now from the plain. They are in their thousands, moving quietly, but the air is stirred by the rolling wheels and the clashing arms. A whole nation must be afoot, falling upon Israel. The noise echoes from our walls like the noise of the sea. Why does God hurl nations against one another? There is room for all beneath the skies. There is still plenty of land unplowed. Many forests still await the axe. Yet men turn their plowshares into swords and hew living flesh with their axes. I cannot understand. End quote. Footnote from Jeremiah by, what was his name? Stephen Zweig. Habakkuk's question was the same. Perplexed by the way the Lord permits the faithless man to swallow up the man more righteous than he, and observing how the successive conquerors are like fishermen dragging men into their nets from the sea of these contemporary troubles, he shrewdly observes how all these conquerors become drunk with their own achievement and turn to worship their own power. Then he asks the pertinent question, quote, is he then to keep on emptying his nets and mercilessly slaying nations forever? Habakkuk's answer, contemporaneous with that of Jeremiah, comes with surprising clarity. For the one who has been called the skeptic prophet, the vision has its own appointed hour. It ripens, it will flower. If it be long, then wait, for it is sure, and it will not be late. Habakkuk 2:5, translated by Moffat. Quote, behold him whose soul is not upright, in him shall fail, but the righteous shall live by faith. End quote. Habakkuk dimly divines what Jeremiah came to know. Quote, behold ye among the heathen, and regard and wonder marvelously, for I will work a work in your days which ye will not believe, though it be told you. Habakkuk 1:5. So the words of the superscription of the book of Jeremiah, toneless as they are, take on an almost startling resonance when sounded within the acoustical setting of the history that was about to unfold. They are inaugural for a long record that grows continually more somber. Josiah, meaning whom Yahweh heals. Jeremiah, meaning whom Yahweh hurls. Jerusalem, meaning habitation of peace. These simple names, which sound flat to us, were names in ruin to those whose sad inheritance was heaped upon them. Verses 4 through 10, the Divine Commission. The first unit of the book of Jeremiah is in the form of a dialogue. The Lord speaks, Jeremiah replies, and the Lord responds to his reply. This is the poetic distillation of Jeremiah's years of reflection on his call. And though it is supplemented with the visions, it is significant that the consciousness of God as over against him, as a genuine and invincible otherness, is placed first in the order of his recollection. The importance of this must not be minimized. It is what the contemporary theologian means by the divine-human encounter. The biblical conception of truth is truth as encounter. Faith, which appropriates God's self-revelation in his word, is an event, an act, and that a two-sided act, an act of God and an act of man. An encounter takes place between God and man. Unquote, Emil Brunner, The Divine Human Encounter. For Jeremiah, the central point of this encounter was the word of the Lord which came to me, saying. In the encounter, the prophet, quote, meets in faith the God who meets him in the word, unquote. Quote, in his word, God does not deliver to me a course of lectures in dogmatic theology. He does not submit to me or interpret for me the content of a confession of faith, but he makes himself accessible to me. An exchange takes place here which is wholly without analogy in the sphere of thinking. The sole analogy is in the encounter between human beings, the meeting of person with person, unquote. From Ibid. It is useful to have this from a theologian. Brunner acknowledges here the peculiar embarrassment of the systematic thinker. He wishes on the one hand, as scientific thinker, to comprehend this relationship objectively, but he must at the same time, and his reader also, appropriate it subjectively, or it is not really comprehended, no matter how many fine words he has spoken. The doubleness in this particular burden and difficulty of theology, the theologian is really a wanderer between two worlds, unquote, from Ibid. Actually, the problem should be put more sharply. He is not really such a wanderer. The two realms are existentially incommensurable. The theologian is really a monologist, extrapolating, almost interminably at times in dogmatics, the infinitely divisible variable compounded in recollection from the lived moment of the dialogue. Here, the other of the lived moment is no longer really met as the other, but merely as a projection of the monologic self. In dialogue, we turn toward the other, where in monologue, the self turns back upon itself. It is important to stress this when approaching Jeremiah. At once, however, a contrary danger arises from the side of mysticism. Berdyaev runs this risk. Footnote. After seeing clearly the need for the prophetic dimension in faith and the shortcomings of traditional theological method, he says, cataphatic theology knows only the objective God, but apophatic theology or mysticism goes beyond the subjectivization of God and releases the conception of God from all anthropomorphic deformities, from Existential Dialectic on the Divine and Human of 1947, page 63. So Berdyaev runs this risk. And no doubt there is, as in Isaiah's vision of the Lord in the temple, an authentic sense of the mysterium tremendum in every profound encounter with God. Nevertheless, Jeremiah's opening account permits us to draw a sharp difference between the prophetic experience of God and that of the metaphysical mystics. Quote, "It is difficult to say how deep the Israelite prophet's inner experience goes, but it is not, as among the mystics, an aim in itself. It is a means by which the prophet is inspired to outward action. It means a strengthening of the will, an incentive to action, in order that he may influence others by what has inspired him. Thus the experience of the prophet, despite much similarity, is different from that of the mystic. The world does not fade away from him, and he does not feel himself changed into God. Hence the prophets of Israel create no new idea of what God is. They experience the ancestral God as power and will." Footnote 7, Johannes Peterson, Israel, Its Life and Culture, 1940. Were one to compare the experiences of Jeremiah, Isaiah, and Pascal in this regard, one would find the sense of the otherness of the living God the most prominent feature of the accounts. Jeremiah is the least quote-unquote mystical in the sense, say, of William James's varieties of religious experience, and Pascal the most. James quotes with approval William Sanday's claim, quote, "The personality of the prophet sinks entirely into the background. He feels himself for the time being the mouthpiece of the Almighty," unquote. Footnote from the Oracles of God. What is important in Jeremiah's witness is the persistent realism of his utterance and its content, especially so in this chapter, which recounts and experiences recollected in tranquility, and marked by the highest degree of clarity and authenticity. The experience serves to clarify his creaturehood, but it clarifies it absolutely, as the philosopher would say. Instead of experiencing the diffusion of his spirit, the prophet's spirit is unified in his finitude as he becomes one with his call. He neither wraps himself in silence, nor steps aside into the accustomed way, not ascends mystically to coalesce with the Godhead. Rather, he steps into the situation which has, so to speak, stepped into him. He responds to the moment and becomes responsible to it. He answers for it. From that point, he begins his speaking. Verse 5, the divine election. When we read verse 5, it is important to bear in mind two things. A, that this account was in all probability dictated by Jeremiah himself, and b, that it was dictated by some 23 years after the event itself and represents the prophet's careful crystallization of the crucial event of his youth. It is proper to note, therefore, with Gilles, the three things which Jeremiah specifies within the call: the foreknowledge, I knew you; the sanctification, I consecrated you; the scope of his commission, I appointed you a prophet to the nations. The Hebraic hyperbole here is the most emphatic way of formulating his sense of destiny, his predestination, his sense of the inescapability of his being chosen. Everything brought him to this moment of consciousness, and everything in the years which follow confirm it as the will of God. It is the power of God, not his fiat, which Jeremiah is trying to communicate. Quote, necessity was laid upon him, as W.R. Thompson says. Unquote. The sensing of being called is not strange, nor even exceptional. It is what ought to be experienced by every dedicated spirit. Quote, do we not recall utterances of Pahotep, of Socrates, of Alexander, of Dante, Spinoza, Montesquieu, Hugo, Froebel, Pitt, Browning, Disraeli, sent out in the teeth of hostile circumstances, asserting a sense of invincibleness in their historic position? We may assume that whenever a supreme type of existence is possible to human nature, it will have numerous analogues and anticipations scattered throughout our common experience. If the prophetic consciousness is possible, it will not be left without witnesses here. Footnote. The burden of the Lord. A simple and obvious analog of this more common kind may be found ready at hand in a letter of the late Thomas Wolfe. Quote, my vision of life is becoming stronger and more beautiful than I thought possible a few years ago. It is the fantasy, the miracle that really happens. For me, at any rate, my life with its beginnings has been a strange and miraculous thing. I was a boy from the mountains. I came from a strange and wild family. I went beyond the state and knew the nation. I went to the greatest city and met strange and beautiful people, good, bad, and ugly ones. I went beyond the seas alone and walked down the million streets of life. When I was hungry and penniless, all manner of strange folk came to my aid. In 1,000 places the miracle has happened to me. It may never come again, but I've had the magic, what Euripides calls the apple tree, the singing, and the gold. Unquote. This is the temptation of the poet, to reduce the exalted consciousness to quote-unquote magic, and Jeremiah also was a poet. He was a boy from the country, from the little town of Anathoth, and he came from a priestly family steeped in the traditions of the meaningful past. But he went beyond the town, and beyond the little state of Judah, and beyond the nation, and he knew the nations. He went to his people's greatest city and met many strange and exacerbated people, good, bad, and ugly ones, and he went beyond their vision of things alone and walked the streets of deep despair. In 1,000 places the miracle happened to him, until, after many years, it became integral to his consciousness. But he never in the world would have said, as Wolfe did, quote, isn't it glorious that this should have happened to me while I was still young and rapturous enough to be thrilled by it? Unquote. On the contrary, when this encounter with the word of the Lord is recollected in tranquility, he still repeats the frightened cry of pathetic dismay, the lonely alas, the cry which again and again was upon his lips in the years he was rejected by men and disesteemed. Verse 6. The dread commission. Moses also recoiled from his divine appointment. Before the flaming bush, he, quote, hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God, unquote. And quite suddenly, he was eloquent with excuse. Augustine, who had also written poetry and was skilled in rhetoric, nonetheless put off the deep encounter. Quote, I, convicted by the truth, had nothing to reply, but the drawling and drowsy words, presently, lo, presently, leave me a little while. But presently, I had no present, and leave me a little while went on a long, long while. And everyone knows his famous prayer, grant me chastity and continency, but not yet. Augustine was also afraid. I was afraid lest thou shouldst hear me soon, and soon deliver me. Yet between Augustine and Jeremiah, however, there lies a dimension of difference. While Augustine had experienced his barren seed plots of sorrows, and had been anxious and full of alarms, he had become to himself an unfruitful land. He had not yet encountered the prophet's God. He had encountered the philosophers universal and the mystics absolute. And while he knew that God somehow opposed me unto myself, and that he had need not to stagger and sway about this way and that, a changeable and half-wounded will, wrestling with one part falling and another rose, he resolved the conflict in this initial phase by withdrawing his mind, quote, from the crowds of contradictory phantasms, so that it might find out that light by which it was besprinkled, when without all daunting it cried out that the unchangeable was to be preferred before the changeable. And thus, with the flash of a trembling glance, it arrived at that which is. The language of Plotinus here is far removed from Jeremiah's account of the Lord's reply. Retreat from history, as Hawking notes, is the mystic's temptation, and he who dwells in the universal alone becomes false. The encounter with reality is too much for the average soul to bear, yet the mystic's encounter must be translated into prophetic power if it is to take hold upon the world. What is striking about the prophetic consciousness is that it is directed outward upon the world. The prophet becomes the bearer of a message having to do with a uniquely living God. This is not to deprive either the poet or the mystic of the authenticity of his witness. In Jeremiah, the poet and the mystic are assimilated to his prophetic task. To poeticize his calling, to ascend mystically to another world of contemplation, would have been for Jeremiah and for the Hebrew religious consciousness generally a form of the quote-unquote great refusal. From Inferno, Canto 3. Jeremiah's temptation is not of this kind. What makes him draw back are the intimations of terror which pertain to every encounter with the Absolute. He is nigh to the misery of Eliphaz, quote, dread came upon me and trembling, which made my bones shake, and a spirit glided past my face, and the hair on my flesh stood up. Job 4. He senses the proximity of the demonic threat. Through endless solitudes shalt thou be drifted. Hast thou through solitudes and deserts fared? From footnote Faust Part 2, Act 13. He has reached the dread point of the summons, and vaguely knows that, quote, those who follow me are led onto that glassy mountain where no foot holds for logic, to the bridge of dread where knowledge but increases vertigo. From W.H. Auden's The Summons. Even more deeply, he has begun to experience the awful daring of a moment's surrender. T.S. Eliot, What the Thunder Said from the Wasteland. The awful daring of a moment's surrender, when the surrender is absolute and to the absolute. He has felt what George Eliot once called that thorn pressure of his particular crowning. Jeremiah protests his youth not merely because, quote, in Oriental society a young man has a role to play, unquote, but because he is overwhelmed and intimidated by the awful arrogance of setting aside princes, priests, and people to become a prophet to this nation and proclaim a view of God which goes beyond the apprehension of his time. Warm-hearted, affectionate, not given to strife, a young man well trained in the learning and traditions of his people, timid in spirit, with the sensibilities of a poet, he might well have felt something of the trepidation of Job when that man, or his author, from the land of Uz, was forced to regard the traditional patterns as narrow and outgrown. It is for this reason that the Lord's reply is so significant. Verses 7 and 8, the divine rebuke. Young or old, learned or uninformed, handsome or crippled, none of this matters. All that pertains to the ego, which must be collapsed in order that the own self may arise. All this pertains to my powers, to my status, to my will to have reality on my special terms. This is the mark of that primary defection of the self, quote unquote, curved in upon itself, the projected ego which would override its creaturehood and exalt itself in its own image. Jeremiah is not to go on his own terms. God will send him, and he will go on God's terms. God will command him, and he shall speak, and his word shall be to all whom he is sent, and it shall consist in whatever he is told to speak in the specific situations as they arise, whether agreeable to his youth, temperament, moods, or station in life. To be sure, it is a shock to encounter the otherness of capital R reality in this form. But the whole of reality is such an otherness, and demands this sort of subjective authenticity in some form from each of us. When the antennae of our self-interesting, which are projected so far in advance of our dissembled self-seeking, touch ever so slightly upon the genuine, the absolute, the real, they wince from the encounter with a shuddering recoil, and the self contracts into its protective shell. For the vast majority of people, this refuge is the crowded collective, the covering anonymity. As Kierkegaard speculates, quote, "It is most comfortable to stride unknown through the world without being known to His Majesty the King. To be known by God in time makes life so acutely strenuous. Wherever He is, there every half hour is of tremendous importance. But to live in that manner is not endurable for 60 years. Footnote, the concluding unscientific postscript, page 402. Surely it is not endurable to the self which does not wish to be an authentic self, which has not the courage, as Paul Tillich puts it, to accept acceptance from the courage to be. As Tillich notes in his meditation on Psalm 139, quote, "Man desires to escape God. Men of all kinds, prophets and reformers, saints and atheists, believers and unbelievers have the same experience. It is safe to say that a man who has never tried to flee God has never experienced the God who is really God." Footnote from the Shaking of the Foundations. It is made plain to Jeremiah that the point at issue has not to do with the sum of his powers or the excellence of his talents or any other ego concern. Then the mask is removed from his reticence. It is possible for him to become the messenger, one whose function is to deliver the message. On behalf of the message, and in consideration of its sender, he is not to be afraid of them. He goes not on his own strength, but in God's. He speaks not on his own authority, but on the authority of the Lord. "I am with you to deliver you," says the Lord. The qualms of the egocentric consciousness may be set aside as the messenger assumes his proper vocation. The principle is the same as the apostles' quote, "Yet not I, but Christ in me," of Galatians 2:20, source of strength and power. Here the ego perishes, so long as it remains constant to its call. This is probably the initial crisis point in Jeremiah's inner experience. Here, his quote-unquote own law, as the psychologist would describe it, Carl Jung, and the law of the Lord become one. To be a prophet or an apostle on one's own terms would be arrogance. Quote, "Divine authority is the decisive factor." Footnote from Kierkegaard, The Present Age, page 144. Jeremiah here learns the inner meaning of the words attributed to Luther, quote, "The word of God is a battle, a ruin, a sword," unquote. What begins as a battle and continues more often than not as a battle within, accomplishes the ruin of the private ego before it becomes a sword. But what is always miraculous in this most shattering of the individual's pretension, there comes the singular touch of the hand of God. Verses 9 through 10, the divine appointment. The word of the Lord is here visualized in keeping with the Hebrew habit of thinking concretely in metaphor and figure, and hyperbole, quote, which invests everything with bodily form. Unquote. Not only is the figure used elsewhere in Scripture, but it recurs in Jeremiah in unique and splendid expression. He writes, "Thy words were found, and I ate them. And thy words became to me a joy, and the delight of my heart." What is here signified is that he is filled with the sense of the inward presence of God. Two things are surprisingly absent from this account. In the first place, there are no expressions either of poetic or prophetic ecstasy. The verse quoted above shows clearly that Jeremiah knew the sweetness of this inner joy, but even here the restraint of his phraseology is significant. One may speak justifiably of Pascal's quote-unquote night of religious ecstasy, as depicted in his account of his midnight experience of November 23rd, 1654, with its testimony, quote, "of joy, 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 tears of joy," unquote. Or one may speak of the cultivation of ecstasies among the early Hebrew prophets. This held for the prophetic societies of the times of Saul and Samuel, and may be seen in the practices of Ezekiel. But to hold that, quote, "no one has given a stronger expression in the ecstatic transports of the prophets than Jeremiah and Ezekiel," unquote, is misleading as far as Jeremiah is concerned. The perspectives of depth psychology throw a much firmer light on Jeremiah's account of himself than has been recognized. Buttenweiser very likely puts the matter too strongly when he holds that, quote, "the inspiration of the great literary prophets has nothing in common with the ecstasy of the prophets of the older type," unquote. But Gordon is clearly on sound ground when he recognizes that the development of prophecy evolved a higher and lower type. Quote, "the lower prophets adhered to the ecstasy, which became in its mature form the trance or dream. Today we should call it self-hypnotism, and this is indeed just the charge that Jeremiah levels against them," unquote. Gordon cites W. Robertson Smith, quote, "the characteristic of the true prophet is that he retains his consciousness and self-control under revelation," unquote. The scorn which Jeremiah heaps upon the prophets who, quote, "speak visions with their own mind," unquote, and protest the prophetic authority by crying, quote unquote, I have dreamed, is itself an ample witness to Jeremiah's rejection of the lower prophetic practices. The second remarkable aspect of this touch of the hand of God is the singular absence of any guilt consciousness in Jeremiah's account of it. When Isaiah beheld the Lord high and lifted up, his first exclamation was, "A woe is me, for I am a man of unclean lips." The truth of the Lord, which he had doubtless proclaimed theretofore, had been spoken in the name of a conception and experience of God so far below which was now revealed to him, that he was quick to perceive the gap of ungodliness which distance from the true word of God made plain. Augustine also, throughout the early portions of his Confessions, exposes a manifold guilt consciousness. But these are not Jeremiah's problems. Once he had passed the basic shock encounter, in which, as Tillage says, quote, "nobody wants to be known," he was ready for the definition of his task. The task is twofold. He is to be a prophet to the nations, and its burden will consist in the necessary plucking up and breaking down of the false and the wicked in order that the true and the righteous may be planted and built. For this purpose the Lord says to him, "I have put my words in your mouth." This is the proclaimed word, and it carries intrinsic power within itself. This is not, however, to be understood magically. To hold, as it is sometimes done, that the Hebrew conception of prophecy regarded the word as quote-unquote affecting its own fulfillment is a dangerous half-truth. As the word uttered by the prophet were filled with his divine energy and, quote, passed from the prophet's lips into an independent existence of its own, end quote. To discount the poetic virtue of metaphorical speech in this fashion is to lose the intrinsic virtue of the prophetic power. The true word, the word of God, is the living word. It necessarily transfigures the inert forms. Such a word cannot return empty. As Martin Buber observes, the divine word, quote, breaks into the whole order of the word world. It suddenly descends into the human situation, unexpected and unwilled by man, is free and fresh like lightning. And the man who has to make it heard is over and over again subdued by the word before he lets it be put into his mouth. end quote. Footnote, the prophetic faith. No, that's for something else. Scratch that. I think that's from man, between man and man. The language here is still poetic, which is truly equal of Ezekiel's vision of the dry bones and of Zechariah's vision, and of the flying roll. But an attempt is made to formulate the dimension of transcendence which shatters the congealed forms of the conspiracies of our immanence. The prophet, caught between the nether millstone of his historical situation, moving rapidly toward its catastrophe, and the upper millstone of the absolute, moving always into dialectical encounter through the word, is himself plucked up and destroyed at this precise point of the Lord's planting. It is the word so derived that sets him, i.e., makes him an overseer, the Lord's deputy, over the nations. Even if Jeremiah never traveled and spoke only to the people of Judah, his word and the authority of his word is clearly for the nations. It is for the historical hour as such. He experiences the matrix of his time's history from within, at its most sensitive point of inner awareness, where the clash of powers, the shaking of foundations, evokes through stress and suffering, the destruction and exile, a higher God consciousness than his world had known. Jeremiah clearly grasps the magnitude of the collision of powers, but he sees in this God's action in history, with the inevitable judgment that sooner or later must befall the God defiant, and the necessary overthrowing which must precede the world's renewal. Hence the double metaphor, that of the pulling down if the great architect is to rebuild, and that of plucking up if the gardener is to replant. Here is the ground theme of the book of Here the ground theme of the book of Jeremiah is first introduced. This people will, in Jeremiah's time, be plucked up and scattered far from this land. In due time, a remnant will return, that the land may be replanted by the purified faithful and become faithful unto the Lord once more. So also this present building, from the great temple to the very walls of Jerusalem itself, shall in Jeremiah's time be overthrown and destroyed. Then, after many years of remembering Zion by the waters of Babylon, and sifting the memory while a great winnowing of the world powers is going on, a purified remnant shall return to build the new Jerusalem. The recurrence of this in chapter 42:10 and 45:15 gives startling unity to the book as a whole. God also is revealed as the sufferer who has been obliged to break down and to pluck up what he himself had attempted to build and to plant. Should it appear that the oracles against the nations collected in chapters 46 through 51 are largely from Jeremiah's hand and come from the earliest period of his prophecy, as has been recently maintained, then Jeremiah's appointment as a prophet to the nations is clear. Regardless of this, it is necessary to say that in the hour of the world's destiny, the plight of the people is inevitably bound up with that of the colliding powers. Verses 11 through 16, the two visions. These visions must presuppose the long gestation of a deep concern. Jeremiah had clearly fled long since to his solitude, to learn there the troubled silence of the hidden self and the hard-won patience of long waiting on the Lord. John Skinner's remark, and that the dialogue preceding these visions could not have been the beginning of Jeremiah's fellowship with Yahweh, but is, quote, the consummation of a genuine religious experience, rooted probably in the pieties of home and early life, of a growing self-knowledge and knowledge of God, which now ripens into the consciousness of a special mission, unquote, must be assumed. The symbols of the experience often precede by many years the conscious formulation of the what, which they have now proposed in visionary form. In the instance of the almond branch, and in that of the cauldron to follow, the vision symbols are not forgotten, but grow in implication. They become distillation points within that which was the most nebulous in the prophet's inner life, drawing all his conflicts steadily upon their forms. The almond rod and the cauldron are typical transformation symbols, the one masculine and phallic, with potential creativity superaboundingly implied, the other, its feminine counterpart, point to the threatening evils of the subconscious. The cauldron was, for Freud, a frequent symbol of the subconscious. Calkins is right here in pointing to the contrast between the two visions, the one simple, the other terrible. And in holding that in this contrast, we see, at the very outset of his career, the tragic contrast in Jeremiah's soul. The two visions belong together as symbolizing Jeremiah's own inner struggle when he begins to sense that he is called to become one against the world, a call that is bursting with the splendor of deliverance and renewal on the one hand, and fraught with dangers, desolation, and ruin on the other. Quote, the inner voice, as Jung says, is the voice of a fuller life, of a wider, more comprehensive consciousness. Unquote. At the same time, and at this point, and this is the point we must stress, quote, the inner voice brings to consciousness whatever the whole, whether the nation to which we belong, or the humanity of which we are a part, suffers from, unquote, from Integration of the Personality, page 302. When the vision of the almond branch and the vision of the boiling cauldron are projected outward upon the world, they formulate wonderfully the positive and negative features of Jeremiah's prophecy. Verses 11 and 12. The almond branch. Anyone who has lived in some land of the almond will not fail to respond to the incomparable loveliness of this first vision. There is nothing quite like the almond tree, the first to awaken in the spring. Its nearest rival is the cherry tree, which A.E. Hausman has celebrated so beautifully. Quote, loveliest of trees, the cherry now is huge with bloom along the bough, and stand in the woodland ride, wearing white for Eastertide. Hug with bloom along the bough. The poetic leap from the cherry white to the Eastertide is similar in kind to that which Jeremiah makes from the almond rod, the wake tree, the first to waken in the spring, to the picture of God watching over his people. Hausman, the poet, knew how images such as these set up, quote, the string tremor of unreasonable excitement in some region deeper than the mind, unquote, where they will often, quote, with sudden and unaccountable emotion, give rise to the unanticipated poem. We may suppose Jeremiah's case that, seeing the dry, barren branch of winter break almost suddenly into bloom, he was moved almost by free association of the Hebrew words from shaked, almond tree, meaning awakeness or watchfulness. The almond tree wakes into bloom as early as January, to the shoked, and the sense that the Lord was awake and watchful, a difference of only one vowel. One of the most apt translations here is that of Earl B. Marlatt, who, playing upon both word and image, touches the line with aesthetic splendor. Thou hast well seen, for behold, I bloom through my word to perform it. There is here no intrinsic violence, for the vision is laden with an infinite effulgence, which is central and essential to Jeremiah's sense of God's relation to the world. The world may be spiritually dead, the people moribund, the winter of ungodliness upon them all, but the word is ready to break through always, a living word, through which God's righteousness bloom as he performs it. Many scholars hold that Jeremiah saw the almond branch and the cauldron, as he saw the fig and the potter's wheel, and formulated their special significations with rhetorical deliberateness. It would seem, on the contrary, that the branch and the cauldron are dream symbols, formulated by the unconscious out of Jeremiah's undaunted experience of the almost through recurring springtide seasons from his boyhood on, and precipitated into the conscious mind at the time when what was repressed in him came into conflict with that which he was called to become. As such, the symbols were mysterious and invincible, compelling the consciousness. The one was projected upon by reality as the intuition and promise of God, and the other of impending gloom, the threat of disaster, the divine warning. Verses 13 through 16. The divine warning. Skinner would seem to be psychologically sound when he interprets the cauldron symbolism as both magical and mysterious, like the witches in Macbeth or Faust Part 1. Upon a low hearth stands a great cauldron under which a fire is burning. Various figures appear in the vapors which rise from the cauldron. Here in Jeremiah's vision is the image of the magic cauldron brewing in the mysterious north and sending deadly fumes which will carry ruin and desolation over the world, an emblem of a sense of calamity which already haunted Jeremiah's mind, and was to find impassioned expression in his earliest poetic effusions. This means that these visions reflect something of Jeremiah's inner struggle, but they also show how squarely and unflinchingly he looked at reality. Meanwhile, we should note with Jung that the symbol of 4 is emotional excitement or sudden burst of impulse, and if a pot is set upon the fire, then one knows that transformation is underway. This is what we have in this dream symbol. Its formulation toward the public fact is clear. Out of the north, evil shall break forth upon all the inhabitants of the land. This danger was apparent already in the fall of Israel to the Assyrians. The rise of the Babylonian power is coincident with Jeremiah's life work. The unanticipated Scythian hordes which sweep over the Asiatic world at this time in a succession of raids and insufficient strength to extract gifts from the king of Egypt may also have served to make apparent the northern peril. Though the projection of these vision symbols upon the factual conflict of the time, Jeremiah's inner struggle with himself is in principle effectively resolved. The extent to which the sense of vocation appealed only to one side of his nature, while the other side cries out in protest against it, is here assuaged through acceptance of his high vocation. The evil descending out of the north upon all of Judah is clearly foreseen by Jeremiah. The cauldron itself is apparently situated in the north, and when the cauldron is blown open and 4 beneath it fanned from the north, the empires of the north will siege to Jerusalem. The manifold evils of this seething brew will break forth upon all the inhabitants of the land. The manifold evils of this seething brew, copywriting error. The addition of verse 15 by the Deuteronomic editor after the fall of Jerusalem does not violate, in principle, the threat which Jeremiah sees quite clearly at the beginning of his work. And this may be said also of verse 16, which assigns as the inward cause of this calamity the infidelity and the idolatries of the people. These are rooted in a wrong relation to God. Verses 17 through 19, the divine power. Here the call is imperative. The dialogue is ended, the command is given. By virtue of his faithfulness to the command, Jeremiah will be flung into the storm center of conflict between God and the world, between faith and despair. Footnote from Paul S. Menier's Eyes of Faith. It is inevitable that suffering and dismay will arise when perspectives of an unfaithful people are contradicted by the spokesman of God. He will stand like Athanasius contra mundum, like Luther at Worms, against the whole land, against kings, princes, priests, and people. He will know, quote, the separateness, the awful responsibility, the power of the single soul. From footnote George Adam Smith, Jeremiah, page 88. Too soon, also, he will come to know the hard hostility of the thousands of estranged faces that miss the many-splendored thing. Footnote Francis Thompson, The Kingdom of God. Hence the injunction, do not be dismayed by them, lest I dismay you before them. For Jeremiah's task will not be measured by the approval of the multitude or the plaudits of the crowd. He whose inner strength is not great enough to dispense with these will certainly feel the dismay of the sensitive soul when refused and rejected by the people, and also waver, quail, and be overborne by their callous stubbornness. The insight here is psychologically sound, though paradoxical. If Jeremiah exhibits fear and suffers himself to be intimidated by the opposition or of the official or the people, God will break him down before them, i.e., the reflex of his evident timidity will but serve to elicit scorn and derision toward him on the part of those whom he must accuse. It is misleading to say with Smith that this warning implies that Jeremiah was wanting in manly courage, that his strength as a poet may have been his weakness as a man, that God does not speak thus to a man unless he sees that he needs it, and that it was to him, most impetuous and unstable disciple that Christ said, "Thou art Peter, and on this rock I will build." It is not Jeremiah's weakness that in his temptation, but his strength. It is precisely because Jeremiah has had the courage enough to think beyond the thoughts and practices of the people and the authorities, and because he is sensitive enough in spirit and candid enough to perceive the fatal limitations in public behavior and private pride, that he has dared to confront himself and his time with the dimension of the absolute, at once the most edifying and terrifying experience that can come to a sensitive soul. The problem of fear here is paradoxical in the sense in which Pascal knew the identical paradox. Quote, "Fear not, provided you fear, but if you fear not, then fear." What is meant by this is well known by the poet and the prophet and saint. Yeats speaks of certain, quote, personifying spirits of the past who, through their great dramatic power, quote unquote, bring souls to crisis. They have but one purpose, he says, to bring their chosen man to the greatest obstacle he may confront without despair. This is an interesting reading of the problem of destiny, which is compounded in Yeats from many sources. And though his notion of these personifying spirits, or of the daimon, remains as nebulous and uninformed as with the Greeks, his intuition in depth is remarkably clear. Quote, "I think that all religious men have believed that there is a hand not ours in the events of life. When I think of life as a struggle with the daimon, who would ever set us to the hardest work among those not impossible, I understand why there is a deep enmity between man and his destiny, and why a man loves nothing but his destiny." Footnote, Meaning of God and Human Experience, page 513. Essays, page 499. The tension of this deep enmity is, in Jeremiah, expanded to the absolute, for his daimon is the word of Yahweh. There is such a thing, says Hawking, as losing one's soul, and that is rejecting one's call to prophesy. Footnote, Meaning of God and Human Experience. It is this which makes the third great metaphorical passage in verse 18 so decisive, whether placed here as integral to this initial consciousness of call, or whether borrowed from the second religious crisis in chapter 15. Jeremiah is not to speak in his own strength, nor will his strength be as the strength of 10, because his heart is pure. He will speak in God's strength, because when the officials and the people lay siege to him, Yahweh will make him like a fortified city, and like an iron pillar, and like bronze walls. The people will fight against him, but they shall not prevail. The metaphors are obvious and powerful. The vision of the almond branch to contain the wakefulness and watchfulness of God is here carried over to link the metaphors of his prophetic appointment. The decisive element in the experience of Jeremiah's persuasion that he is forced into this position, that God helping him, he can do no other, and that it is precisely the power of God that is forcing him. Quote, "A man cannot in reason embark upon the voluntary, the requirements of which are higher than the universal requirements, unless he has an immediate certainty that it is required of him in particular." End quote. Footnote, Journals of Soren Kierkegaard, page 413. Otherwise, the pretension to speak the word of God would be presumptuous. But Jeremiah has this sense, and just for this reason the term genius, the term poet, or the term mystic does not apply here. A genius, as Samuel Johnson somewhere says, is a man of broad general powers accidentally determined to some particular end. Jeremiah is not accidentally determined. He feels he is compelled. By the same token, the term reformer does not apply. Those whom we would call reformers, wrote Max Scheler, such as Savonarola and Luther, distinguish themselves in this, that they never preach a new doctrine, but on the contrary preach a, quote, return to the origins. Jeremiah is not without a certain definite doctrine of return, as we shall see, but he feels compelled to proclaim both the genuinely old and the radically new. Kierkegaard's distinction between the genius and the apostle applies in part, quote, just as a man sending into the town with a letter has nothing to do with its contents, but has only to deliver it, so too an apostle has really only to be faithful in his service and to carry out his task. Therein lies the essence of an apostle's life of self-sacrifice. It is otherwise with the genius, who has only an immanent teleology. It develops itself, and while developing itself, the self-development projects itself as its work. The genius lives in itself. From the present age. One may point out, in light of the evidence and continuing agony of Jeremiah, that Kierkegaard's illustration of the letter is unfortunate and fails to existentialize the notions of mission and authority. Clearly, what is paradoxical in the prophet's situation, however it may be with the apostle, is that Jeremiah has everything to do with the message, because the message has everything to do with him. Nevertheless, Kierkegaard comes nearest to describing the prophetic dimension when he notes that the apostle is, quote, absolutely paradoxically teleologically placed. The categories of immanence focus absolutely in his confrontation with the Lord, whose word, paradoxically, cuts across the universal practice and opinion which nails him out in isolation as the pretentious exception. Yet he is without presumption, since his purposes are the purposes of God. He is the one whom Yahweh hurls, the one who stands at the conflux of the ages, holding eternity in his hands. In him we see those desperate tides of the whole great world's anguish forced through the channels of a single heart. Footnote, F.W.H. Myers, St. Paul. End of chapter 1.